So in the potential category called sympathy for the devil, we're going to have a look at Kevin Spacey's childhood. There is so much that is illustrative and instructive. So listen, this is all my opinion. I'm not a professional, but it's all my opinion. You don't have to have a miserable life. You don't have to repeat abuse. You don't have to be tormented and tortured by abuse if you suffered abuse as a child. You don't have to fear replication. You don't have to fear re-offending. You don't have to fear that you're some massive flesh cage for the dangerous id demon of explosive childhood reenactments. You don't. I went through a brutal and violent childhood, most of which I've never even really talked about, but suffice to say it was nasty stuff as a whole. I am a peaceful, gentle father whose daughter loves him enormously, who I love enormously, and I've never raised my voice at her, I've never hit her, I've never neglected her, I've never punished her. There are consequences, which is different from punishment. And it's a wonderful family life. I have a wonderful, loving wife, been married for 15 years, we stay together forever. It's a wonderful, great life. And I came from a tortured and violent and abused history. It doesn't have to be this way. And the question is, how do you break the cycle? Now, philosophically and personally, I have some things to say about it, which I hope will be helpful. I know they'll be helpful, but difficult. So, first of all, you need to identify the evil as a chosen action by the people in your family. That's number one. You have to specifically identify evil that resulted from free will choices that your parents made. Let's just talk about parental abuse. Let's just say beatings. This would apply to other things. So if your parents beat, let's say it's your father. If your father beat you, he chose to beat you, and he could have chosen to not beat you. You say, oh, how do we know he could have chosen to not beat you? Well, the question is, if he had been standing in front of a policeman, would he have beaten you? If he'd been standing at a mall, if he'd been in church, if he'd been in some public place where negative repercussions could have accrued to him by beating you, if he had, really gone to town and you pulled out his leather belt, beaten the hell out of you right in front of a policeman, did he ever do that? In general, of course not. I'm not talking about genuinely insane people, but just the people, because insanity is different from evil. So if the abuse was hidden in your household, then your parents, your father in this case, had the perfect and absolute capacity to not abuse you. Why? How do we know that? Because he didn't abuse you in public. He didn't abuse you at a parent-teacher meeting. Did he turn around and punch you in the head right in front of the teacher? No. I bet you he was all kinds of civilized. Maybe a couple of evil stink-eye glances about what awaited you when you got home. But I bet you he was perfectly civilized in those kinds of situations. And people wouldn't guess, wouldn't imagine, wouldn't know, would have no idea what he was capable of behind closed doors. So when you can control your behavior in public, it means, guess what? You can control your behavior, which means that unleashing your evil in private is a choice. You are perfectly capable of not abusing, but you choose to abuse when you won't get caught. And this is a fundamental defense, right? If you say you're insane, then you should not avoid trying to be caught. But the moment you avoid trying to be caught, you're not insane, and therefore you are evil. If you can control your own behavior in public, it means you don't have to abuse. You don't have to be an abuser, which means if you enact it in private, it's a perfect 100% free will, free choice enactment of evil. It is a self-indulgence. That kind of abuse, any kind of abuse. Again, assuming that it was hidden. So if it was not known to others, that means it is evil, not crazy. Now, Kevin Spacey's childhood was monstrous, horrifying, and horrible. I have no doubt whatsoever that Kevin Spacey's father's childhood was monstrous, horrible, and abusive. So then we say, but my father who beat me himself had a terrible childhood. No, it's not enough. And here's the most dangerous thing. If you make that excuse, what you're saying is a bad childhood means that you can be forgiven or it can be understandable, or there's some justification for you being abusive as an adult. Your father lives within you. The child is the father of the man. Your parents live within you. We are not individuals. We are what I call the ecosystem. We are an ecosystem of competing perspectives, which is why we debate with ourselves, which is why we argue with ourselves, which is why people who do horrible things often hear parental voices yelling at them. We have a competing ecosystem of personalities and perspectives in our minds. We are not one thing. It's like saying a jungle is one thing. No, a jungle is an ecosystem, and we are an ecosystem. Our identity is complicated. It's why people can write plays, because they have more than one person. You go read Eugene O'Neill's A Long Day's Journey into Night, a play that cost him so much emotionally that he demanded it never be performed until at least 10 years after his death, about his morphine-addicted mother and his fame-addicted father. So we are complicated. Now, we also universalize. Whatever rule we apply to our parents will be consciously or unconsciously applied to ourselves. So if we say, well, our parents did bad things, but they themselves had bad childhoods, what you're saying is, if your parents abused you, if your father abused you in this case, then you're saying, well, I can do bad things in the future, but I had a bad childhood, so it's okay. Or it's not as bad, or it's whatever, right? See, this is giving yourself, if you give your parents forgiveness, you give yourself permission. You understand how this works? And you cannot give yourself permission to reenact evil, to become evil. There is no excuse. None whatsoever. If you give no excuse to your parents, you give no excuse to yourself. If you give free will to your parents, you get free will for yourself. If you give evil to your parents, you get to drop the burden of evil yourself. Somebody's got to hold it. If you say, well, they did the best they could with the knowledge they had, how is that falsifiable? What's the null hypothesis for that hypothesis? How could you disprove it? It's impossible. So it's not a standard of any. It's a standard of forgiveness and self-erasure. Because whatever you justify in terms of the evil your parents did to you, you are then punishing yourself for being angry about it. Because anger, in the face of that which instead should be understood, is an irrational and immature response. So get angry at the sky for raining is immature and it's ridiculous. It's irrational. And so if your parents were nobly struggling under the burden of their own childhood and unfortunately lashed out against their better judgment and did the best they could and you should forgive, then the natural anger you have about being violated gets recast as immaturity and pettiness. And you don't get the chance to use that anger to build healthy barriers and boundaries and choose better people in your life as an adult. It's toxic. In my view, it's a toxic and destructive perspective. If you forgive your parents, then you give yourself permission to reenact. So you give them 100% free will. You take away the excuse of their bad childhood. What that does is it gives you 100% free will and choice, and it takes away the excuse of your bad childhood. You have to have high standards in order to improve, and you can't have high standards for yourself and low standards for your parents. That's just another form of abuse. You understand? So you give them 100% responsibility, and they did evil to you, if this is what happened. And this liberates you from the cycle of history. This breaks the chain. This breaks the cycle. This gives you a choice. But you cannot take in your mind, in your heart, in your soul, you cannot take more choice than you are willing to give to your parents. You cannot take more moral responsibility than you are willing to give to your parents. It's impossible. Logically, it won't work. It can't happen.